Very good evening, namaste, and welcome to Citti Media. I'm your host Sharan Sethi. Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman presented yet another budget, and the Modi government has delivered one of the shortest budget speeches in the recent history. And a lot of debating points and talking points have emerged as a result of the budget, as India is still reeling through a pandemic. To discuss this, we have a very special panel tonight. We are joined by Urvashi Prasad ji from Niti Aayog, Rajeev Mantri, a venture capitalist. He was here yesterday discussing the pre-budget analysis, and we have Gupta Madhusudan. Namaste, everyone. First of all, thank you for taking out your time and joining me in this conversation. Let me begin by asking Urvashi Prasad ji, something that the government focused on this time, especially as India is reeling through a pandemic, is healthcare reforms. And this has been widely debated, and the opposition has also criticized the government for not doing enough. But on the positive front, something like mental health has been acknowledged positively for the first time by any Indian government for that matter. And there are steps taken towards that. So how would you put things into perspective as far as healthcare reforms are concerned from this particular budget?
Yeah, so I think one thing is very important to note, especially for social sectors. It's true for health, nutrition, many others, that, initiatives have to be seen over a period of time. What the government is doing has to be seen over a period of few years. Everything is not just, 1 year and what is announced there. But a lot of it is to be seen in continuation. So I think that is one thing, because the government has been implementing initiatives in health over the last several years. If you see, many reforms have been brought about, many new schemes have been brought about. So I don't think it's important that we see a new scheme every time, because it's very important to implement, what we have already launched. Having said that, there were a couple of at least, important initiatives that caught my attention from the health sector's perspective. One is on the digital health, the open digital health platform. And I think a lot of people say that, digital is not a substitute. And I agree, and I don't think the government is saying that, digital is going to be a substitute for actual delivery of health services. But what we are acknowledging now, which is very important, is that it's a critical enabler. So on a digital platform, if you can have all your health facilities, providers, you have everyone integrated on one platform, you can imagine the power of that. When you're trying to plan, any type of policy or program in the health space. So I think that's a very powerful initiative. And it was really good to hear that in the budget speech today. The other one, as you rightly mentioned, on the mental health. We all know that mental health is a big challenge, and it has been exacerbated to some extent, to a great extent, by the pandemic. The pandemic has also seen a major adoption of telemedicine. We've also seen that telemedicine adoption really went up over the last couple of years in the country. So I think it's a very good combination there, that we're trying to use telemedicine to address a very, very big challenge of mental health. Of course, the implementation is where we'll have to focus, and the rollout across, the whole country. But I think as an initiative, it is really very, very important. And as you said, the fact that we are even talking about mental health in the union budget speech, I think that itself is a very, very important move and a very important signal.
Right. You bring up a very important point. One of the indications that you even referred to was that this budget was a rather sober one. You expect a lot of dhamaka in every budget, and the government, gives out welfare schemes and subsidies and whatnot. So my question is to Harshji. We didn't see a lot of populism, and the Prime Minister even made a statement one day before the budget was announced, saying that please do not, please ensure that there is no such indication from the budget that may influence the elections in some way, because we have 5 state elections coming up. You've also observed Bengal elections very closely and the kind of populism that works around there. So why does this change come about at this particular juncture?
So I think it's an excellent question. I think if we see it in the perspective of, as you said, state elections coming up, including Uttar Pradesh, which is India's largest state and therefore the most important assembly election. The fact that, if I'm not wrong, in the context of any new rail idea or something. No state as such was directly or explicitly mentioned or focused upon, which we all remember in earlier budgets, including when the rail budget was separate, that so and so state will get XY number of projects. And if the minister happened to be from that state, there will be a further leaning towards that state. I think that kind of thing we are seeing much less. Of course, if we have to mention a project from X to Y, there is a geography involved, but the state was not mentioned. And I think it's a very important signal that despite the most important non-Lok Sabha election in India next month, or starting in this month actually, the fact that there was not much populism, and even though the fiscal deficit is high by historical standards, of course, by COVID standards, it's not. Historical standards, we are now targeting 6.4% of GDP for FY23 coming fiscal year. Last year was 6.8%, revised number is 6.9%, so broadly on track. And of course, this is much more transparent compared to earlier budget numbers. But all that extra money seems to be going towards CapEx. So on CapEx, we have 750,000 crores, which is approximately $100 billion. And if you add in the other CapEx in other departments, it's around $143 billion, actually, more than 10 lakh crores. So it's very interesting that we did not fiscally consolidate, but we did not use that extra fiscal space for electoral populism. And I think even there was no massive cash handout, or as Urvashi was rightly saying, it's not about declaring a new scheme every single time. All that was not done. It was very boring, as you were saying, no dhamaka. And in that sense, it was very reassuring. Less consolidation, more capex, non-glamorous, simple, straightforward budget.
Right. Thank you so much for your observations, and you bring in a very important point. But my question to you, Rajeev ji, is that how sustainable is this on the long run? Because the finance minister also introduced a new concept called Amrit Kal, and perhaps keeping the larger geoeconomics in mind. But we also need to realize that unlike, say, China, we are not an authoritarian state, right? We are a democracy, and there is a chance that there is some other government with a different kind of economics coming into place. And in that case, does this not affect the long vision that the government has for India as to how it envisions India in 2047?
So I think it was actually the Prime Minister who had first referred to Amrit Kal when he spoke about the next 25 years. So we are entering 75 years, or will be completing 75 years on 15th August. We are after 75 years, the Prime Minister said the next 25 years should be the Amrit Kal, which means we should have excellence, we should have prosperity, and so on. So with the Finance Minister referring to that, I think her indication is that productivity enhancement, the kind of infrastructure investment we are seeing, the push for renewable energy, including there was the announcement on electric vehicles would be now having swappable batteries, and there would be standards created to ensure interoperability. So these 3-4 aspects taken together, I think the budget is really trying to position India for the next coming couple of decades, where frankly the PM's vision has always been that if you go back to a speech he made in 2015, he had said, can we be a 20 trillion economy? He had asked that question. I think he's probably the first PM to ever raise this kind of a target.
Right.
So I think they are thinking, the government is thinking on those lines. They want India to really scale up. Like obviously we are at 3 trillion today, and to go from 3 to 5 and beyond, and then hopefully in a decade or so, as Harsh has frequently written, maybe in a decade we reach the 10 trillion mark, and then towards becoming one of the world's largest economies. So we can see that reflected, that vision being reflected in concrete policy actions in the budget, in terms of the infrastructure that is being talked about, the commitments that are made. So FM had said that just this year we would be spending 4% of GDP on capital expenditure. So that's a pretty sizable sum. Yes. And there was a clamor for fiscal consolidation again, that now that the pandemic is winding down, some quarters were saying that let's dial back the spending or control the spending and get more fiscal discipline. But I'm happy to see the government is betting on growth, because if India can grow, and grow sustainably at 9-10%, even reach the 10% mark over the next 3-4 years, then that will put the economy on a very strong footing to become one of the top 2 in the world.
Right. It will, and even if we look at the electoral promises that the BJP of late has been making, even in Uttar Pradesh, they're promising a certain $1 trillion economy, and that has become the narrative, so to speak. And this can be a double-edged sword as well, because it can become a political liability, and the opposition has criticized the government on several occasions. I would refer to Urvashi ji's recent article in a leading magazine, and you write that there is a particular structure in mind that is being proposed, which could perhaps ensure that the transparency of how schemes are implemented and overall governance can be ensured. So could you please tell our viewers about that?
Yes, so actually, along with the budget document, what is also being laid in Parliament, and it's been done this year as well, and it's available online also. So in fact, I encourage everyone to have a look, is the outcome budget. And I think this sort of change has been happening, in the government over the last few years, rather quietly. Because every time we have the budget, obviously the focus is on outlays, and everyone is talking about what money has gone up or down in a particular sector or a scheme. What the outcome budget actually does is that for every single scheme of every ministry, every department in the central government, it lays out very clearly defined outputs, outcomes, and these have been tracked over the last few years and will continue to be tracked. The process is evolving. Definitely the process, we are also improving as we continue to work on this. In fact, the organization I work in, the Development Monitoring Evaluation Office at Niti Aayog, has been involved in this very closely. So it's going through an evolution. We are continuing to improve it every year. But what I want to highlight is the shift in the mindset really in the government space that this is bringing about. That everything is not about how much money is put behind a problem, but really what are we able to get from that money? What are we able to concretely achieve in terms of outputs and outcomes, and feeding that back into the decisions we then make regarding which schemes should be continued, which should be dropped, etc. So I think it's a very, very important mindset shift, and it's a very important transformation that's been happening in the government system.
It can double as a feedback loop is also what you're trying to say. Points very well noted. Harshdeep, we saw a few new announcements, especially as far as the announcement of India's new digital currency is concerned, and they even spoke about crypto, something that's been in the news for a while now. So as far as the newer angles of what has been proposed in the budget are concerned, what fresh changes do you see? You're on mute.
You mentioned the CBDC, the central bank digital currency, or what is right now being colloquially known as the e-rupee.
Yeah.
So just for the viewers to understand what would be an e-rupee. E-rupee would be something like you having money, but not in your Paytm app or some other app, but in, let's say, an RBI app. So it's just basically you having currency like cash, banknotes, or coins, except in digital format, and in a wallet which is held effectively by the RBI, or more broadly, the government of India, the state. And it has radical implications, of course. Other countries are also doing it, most prominently communist China. It has implications in terms of efficiency or financialization or formalization, but also in terms of privacy. And then, of course, benefits in terms of countering illicit flows, terrorism, etc. It also has implications for the financial sector more generally, because a lot of financial intermediation, especially banks, like fractional reserve banking, depends on us, the average citizen, holding money, not with the central bank directly, but with the private or these public sector banks. And then they take that money and give out loans and do intermediation. So it will be a long drawn out process. There are already talks and media reports that the RBI is working on it. So for the Honorable Finance Minister to officially announce it in the budget, it means that it's going ahead. I think it is related to the other point you mentioned, cryptocurrencies, which are actually not currencies, they're basically assets. This is going to be an actual currency based on blockchain, the e-rupee. They are going to now be taxed at 30%, that is capital gains, without any kind of offsetting. So the way I see it is, because crypto assets in India were kind of a fait accompli, they did not want to make it illegal or send people to jail for holding it, but they effectively want to slowly kill it. So they're basically, what they're trying to do is, okay, we have launched our own CBDC based on blockchain. Why do you want to hold this thing which gets you 30% taxed every transaction? But if you still want to, you're welcome. It's a free country. And so the incentives are being laid out in such a manner that people would over time gravitate towards the sovereign blockchain based digital currency, e-rupee. And in other cases, only based on a use case. And if there is something comes out, you're open to that innovation. So I think that is basically how I see this particular very interesting announcement, I must say.
Yeah, and if I may ask a supplementary question, there's been a lot of talk around newer sectors that the government has focused on, but essentially every budget targets the middleman, the middle class family, right? Ideally, and what does it mean for the common tax-paying citizen is what a lot of people are saying, and some have even expressed disappointment.
See, I don't know any budget or any step in which some have not expressed disappointment.
That's true.
It is difficult to imagine any such thing. I think if somebody would just, the Prime Minister, Finance Minister would just wake up and say the sun is rising in the morning, somebody would say, no, there's not. So that's just human nature. But I think what it shows is that there is, for the middle class, honestly, there was not much to do. We already know that petrol levies and excise duties were already cut at the central level a few months ago. In fact, right now, there is a soft curb on the petrol pump prices being changed before the state elections, something which is not very good for, by the way, BPCL and other privatization prospects. Some tax cuts and reliefs had already been done over the last few budgets under the NDA, this Modi government and the earlier Modi government. What was actually expected this year was the highest marginal tax slab, which goes up to 43%, including all the surcharges. That was supposed to be reversed this year by August 15th, 2022. If you go by the earlier statements of the finance minister, the slabs that had been increased in 2019. That has not been done this year. I understand why, because there's a lot of talk about inequality and wealth accumulation for people who deal in financial assets. So for politically, it might have been difficult to do it this year, but I don't think there was any massive expectation from the middle class. Right. Because already you must realize India has one of the world's highest entry-level tax slab, right? Effectively we begin at 4 or 5 lakhs, which is more than twice our per capita income.
Which itself was a mistake in my view, actually.
Yeah, exactly. So we are already starting at a very narrow base, whereas in most developed countries, for example, in the United States, where the per capita income is, say, now $70,000, you effectively start doing the income tax at $20,000. So, you can't build a massive city on the mountain peak, right? So, so I think what they're trying to do is not touch with it, go for predictability, go for better compliance, go for less harassment, and let people grow into that in nominal terms. And that broadens our tax base, because agriculture is obviously a bit of a hot potato, except that they want everything else to grow into this tax base. That's how I read it.
It's very interesting because this approach was never really considered before, because the psychology of the taxpayers is essentially very important as well, because in order to voluntarily get them to pay taxes has been one of the biggest challenges. But as far as startups and MSMEs are concerned, Rajiv ji, would you say that this budget presented something new, and how are the markets responding in general?
No, particularly for, I think, startups. I think the announcement on 25% of the defense R&D spend being allocated towards startups and small companies, I think it's a massive change because the startups were essentially cut off from this entire ecosystem. So this could be the beginning of what's been kind of in a negative sense called the military industrial complex or the defense industrial complex.
Right.
But it need not be seen in that kind of negative light. So that integration between defense establishment, between new ventures, between sort of technology researchers and scientists. So we need to bring that ecosystem together so that both the industry benefits with the downstream effects of defense innovations passing on wider into the economy, which always happens, as we know from historical examples, and even the defense establishment in India being able to build capabilities that are available over here instead of importing everything. So ultimately, if you are looking to become a larger economy, looking to sort of be a global sort of influential world power, then we can't be constantly going to Russia or the US or to Israel or whoever to acquire advanced weapons and defense technology. We have to develop our own technology.
Right.
And we've done that successfully in the past in areas like space and nuclear power and nuclear weapons. There's no reason why our scientists and engineers can't do this. So it's very heartening that I think this has been one of the most forward-looking steps in recent budgets, actually.
And would you say that Gati Shakti is a major enabler for this?
Yeah, so Gati Shakti with the entire infrastructure push there, I think one of the problems with India generally has been the high sort of cost of logistics and transportation. So when we see this kind of a multimodal infra build out, and both with Gati Shakti as well as the national infrastructure pipeline.
Yeah.
So obviously, there will be naysayers who say that, banne to do pehle, ab tak to kuch hua nahi. But we have seen what the government has done in the last 7 years with highways, with airports, with the Jal Jeevan program and other kind of infrastructure projects. So there is reason to have confidence that they can also execute this. So what such infrastructure does is it enhances productivity in the economy. All your assets are able to sweat more, and you essentially enter a different plane altogether, and our businesses become competitive. There are all kinds of offshoot effects which simply can't be captured in numbers actually when you have good infrastructure. So this couldn't have happened soon enough actually. So the faster we can get this done, I mean, if we can do this in the next 5 or 8 years, nothing like it. It would really be a sea change for the country.
Right, and even the implementation has been is being monitored very carefully these days. So even that's a positive indicator. As far as the social sector reforms are concerned, Urvashi ji, what would you add on to what we were discussing earlier as far as healthcare is concerned in parallel sectors?
Yeah, I think, Jal Jeevan, as Rajeev ji mentioned, I think that's a very important one. And that's obviously being implemented, but again we've seen higher allocations and an explicit commitment to reach many more households with pipe water supply. So that's why, in fact, when I say health, we need to look at all these related sectors as well, because ultimately the impact of a lot of this is on people's health, productivity, and actually even the economy, because people are healthier, they are obviously able to be more productive and participate better. So I think the impact of some of these schemes is actually far more sort of wide reaching in that sense. So I would say Jal Jeevan Mission, also on nutrition, the emphasis again on the Saksham Anganwadis, upgrading the Anganwadis, because obviously nutrition is also a very critical sector, and pandemic has given us setbacks in a lot of these areas. So I think again it was good to see the emphasis on that. So I think quite a few important points, but as I said, it's very important to see this budget not in isolation, but really in the context of the broader reforms that have been taking place and the various programs that have been launched over the last few years.
And how would you actually quantify the implementation success across different regions and states of India? Because even if we were to take the case of Uttar Pradesh, also acknowledging the fact that it is going into elections very soon, there are a lot of pluses and minuses. For example, in the Bundelkhand region, you see a lot of irrigation projects that essentially provided a lot of water connections to a lot of farmers and things like that. So which is also helping. But you see the other indices also are not as far as have not met the expectations of the central government and the state government.
I think one thing that I always say when we look at these, indices or even rankings that, Niti Aayog itself does, and I think we always make this point, that we look at incremental changes, because ultimately states in, India are more like countries, and it is actually quite unfair to sort of start comparing all of them at the same level. Uttar Pradesh, there's really very few states that we can actually compare it with, if we look at the sheer size and the diversity. So I think what we therefore measure and focus much more is on the incremental changes. And in that regard, if you see, Uttar Pradesh has actually been doing very well. In fact, on a lot of the indices, we've seen the highest incremental improvement from Uttar Pradesh, from various other states which have started at a much lower baseline. So I think that is very important. Social sector outcomes take time to change. They don't necessarily change in a very short span of time. The investments you make today, you might see the results only a few years down the line in the full sense. But we measure the incremental improvements. And I think there, a lot of these states, which we historically consider as poorer performing states, have actually been doing quite well.
Right. Thank you so much. And perhaps it's the dichotomy of incremental growth and accelerated expectations is why we look at all these things from a different angle. But Harshji, we were also discussing about tax collections, and I think this quarter has, or at least January has recorded one of the highest GST collections. What would you attribute the factors to?
I think there is nothing specific to GST except perhaps the e-way bills and the related higher compliance. If you break it down, some of it is IGST, which is basically based on imports. So that seems to be a bit more buoyant than CGST and SGST. But broadly, I think it is attributable to faster economic growth, very strong recovery, and I would say formalization and financialization, which of course was one of the aims of the GST. The whole idea was this kind of VAT based waterfall kind of taxation, where if I am taxed, I want all my suppliers to be in the net as well, so that if they are in the net, I therefore get the tax rebate based on what I buy from them, and therefore I can offset the taxes that I basically pay or collect on the upfront. So I think that is a big part of it. We are basically now close to hitting $20 odd billion per month in the next few months on the overall GST numbers. We had a record number, as you mentioned, for January. Some of it is based on December data, obviously. So we might see some mild Omicron effect, but then again in March, April, we have some bump because of the year-end reasons. So there will be some volatility in the numbers, but overall the trend is very high. And even if you do a nominal CAGR, compounded annual growth rate, to say a couple of years ago, we are at around, at least for December, we were at around 12 to 13%. Yeah. So remember, these 2 years have been the worst hit pandemic time. And if you break it down, even if let's say 5-6% inflation, we are the real GST collection increases faster than the real GDP increase. So there is some buoyancy over and above the GDP growth. But once again, some of it is a bit more towards IGST than CGST and SGST.
Okay, and what about sectors like the government is also aiming to lead the clean energy revolution, in that direction. So they've announced a lot of new schemes as well. So where is this coming from?
You have to see the entire clean energy revolution in as you rightly mentioned earlier, in a very geo-economic context. So we want to basically put as much of our energy consumption on the grid, so to speak, on the electric grid, because that is something where, first of all, we can produce more. Less clean ways like coal, or increasingly more clean ways like solar, wind plus storage, nuclear, hydro and tidal. Increasingly then using those renewable sources to produce green hydrogen, which then further can actually run some of our factories in the coming years, which is why groups like Adani and Ambani are making big investments in that space. I think Rajeev had just tweeted recently that almost all of our railway tracks are now electrified. So imagine that amount.
They will be by December 2023.
So basically in a couple of years,
there.
I think it's 80% there or something. It will be fully there and within 2 years. So imagine all of that consumption, which would have been diesel, and therefore you'd have to import it from the Middle East or from the shale fields of North America. And it's not just the foreign exchange and the money, but also the geopolitical kind of supply chain risks in the time of war, right? Yeah. All that you have to worry less about, because therefore you can now substitute it with electricity. And then, of course, the dedicated freight corridors will come up. You were discussing freight logistics with Rajeev earlier. In fact, we had a GE locomotive factory, which was initially tooled to be diesel. And it was became a bit of a sunk investment. Then we nonetheless took the hard decision to say we will go towards electric locomotives. And, said whatever has been the sunk cost, it's fine. We'll go completely towards electrification because it makes complete sense. Like in a way, a train is basically 100 EVs on track together, right? 100 EV trucks, so to speak. So I think we are doing very well in terms of these technologies. The idea is geoeconomic, geopolitical, but of course also environmental. Or one part of which it is local pollution in our cities, which is a really problem that we all face.
You're absolutely right. And speaking specifically about railways, we've seen several reforms over the last 5 or 7 years. But still, I think we're stuck in a limbo when it comes to the bullet train project. First of all, my question is, have we even gotten this wrong? What is there a necessity for such projects, especially when our civil aviation is growing at such a rapid pace, Rajiv ji?
No, absolutely. Why isn't there a necessity? I mean, why shouldn't we have high-speed, world-class trains connecting in certain regions, cities like, let's say, the Ahmedabad-Mumbai connection? I think that makes complete sense. And also, please bear in mind, India has received a very large soft loan from the Japanese government, specifically for the bullet train project. So even in terms of the investment and the amount of public money being spent on it, it is much less than what a lot of people will have you believe. And that loan from Japan is tied specifically to the bullet train project, so it's not fungible. We can't take that and do something else with it and so on, right? So I think absolutely India should invest in such projects. There is a case to have it in certain regions to connect like certain urban centers together. And again, like not only does it facilitate that kind of connectivity, but it also brings a certain industrial capability to the country.
Right.
As that bullet train project is building up, there are Indian workers, technicians, engineers who are learning new things about executing such a sophisticated project. And in the future, those skills and those learnings can be implemented for other projects. So there are these knock-on effects always come when we move up the value chain, do more and more sophisticated things. So
for example, there is no train between Bombay and Pune, as Rajiv knows very well, and I don't know, Sharan, which city you are based in. For example, let's for example.
Sorry?
Yeah, or for that matter, between Chennai and Bangalore. Or even from Kolkata to the northeast, for example. I mean, there are some train linkages coming up now with Bangladesh sort of supporting us on that.
Yeah.
And in the future too, these things could happen. So India needs to keep investing in such projects, keep building these capabilities.
Right. And the last sector I think we left out was education. So, how are we seeing the things that are proposed in this particular budget, especially keeping that the NEP goes into implementation? Harshi, would you like to take that?
Oh, well, I think Urvashi might be a better place to answer that, given that she works at the Niti Aayog. But my understanding of the NEP, broadly, there are some areas I agree with, some areas I disagree with. What I liked in the budget was that they have started these channels, which are based on a particular standard academic class, as supplementary education. Again, to echo an earlier point that Urvashi made, this is only a supplement like telemedicine is. It's not a substitute for the actual teaching. I had just written on social media yesterday or so that we have lost a lot of time the last couple of years in lockdowns. People have diverse opinions on that. Be that as it may, what has happened has happened. It would be, I think, well advised to have shorter vacations for the next 2-3 years. Maybe longer hours is not practical given the routine of teachers and parents and everything. But if we can have slightly shorter vacations till say 2024-25, because there has been massive upheaval in our sector, and the true inequality, the true long-term inequality victims of the pandemic have been the less privileged students in our schools, because those who did not have a smartphone, those who could not for all practical purposes log in for these e-classes. And if you look at surveys like Acer, the Pratham surveys and all that, there has been a clear trend towards private schools until the pandemic hit, right? Because one of the reasons obviously was that low income salaries suddenly declined. These blue collar jobs suddenly declined very unfortunately and precipitously. So they had to kind of go back to government schools. So that trend might again reverse, but it is kind of symptomatic of the damage that has happened. And like Rajiv and other people, I'm extremely bullish on India, but ultimately it all comes down to human capital, right? So I think we have to, NEP is part of pedagogy and reforms and languages and this and that, but just enough number of hours, just good old raw teaching, that has, I am very afraid, suffered in the last few months to 2 years, and that some way or the other we have to make up in the coming years.
Thank you so much. Have a good evening, and namaste. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.